Good evening and welcome to Thursdays with NAMI. My name is Peg Morrison. I'll be your host tonight. I am the Assistant Director of NAMI North Carolina. That's the National Alliance on Mental Illness North Carolina. I'm glad y'all are here. Thursdays with NAMI is our way of building conversations and building community around the topic of mental health. Tonight's guest is Dr. Douglas Engelman. He's the author of A Boy Broken, a Father's Journey through his son's mental illness, loss, and a search for meaning. Powerful book, powerful cover. The book focuses on Dr. Engelman and his son, Douglas Jr., who lived with schizophrenia until his abrupt death at a young age. As many of us at NAMI know, telling our story is a way of healing ourselves while creating safe spaces for other people to heal themselves. We'll be hearing Dr. Engelman's story in just a minute. He's making a big difference for a lot of young people. As usual, the first part of the show will be an interview with our guest. Partway through, we'll show a video of the week, and then we'll spend time answering questions from you, members of our virtual studio audience on Zoom and Facebook. Now we'll have a quick word from our sponsors. Thursdays with NAMI is funded in part by the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services through the Federal Community Mental Health Block Grant Fund. I think I'm getting pretty good at that quick radio voice. So welcome, Dr. Engelman. I'm allowed to call you Doug, so I'm going to switch to that.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you for joining us. So we always love to know the background of our guests. Tell us about yourself in a nutshell.
That's a difficult question. I'll try to do this as quickly as possible. I think the way to approach it is to talk about the fact that I'm 73 years old, and I only recently came up into a place in my life where I'm doing something that I think makes a difference or could make a difference in the world. And having spent 65 years or so not doing things that I think are relatively important, I'm so proud and happy to be doing what I'm doing. I'm the product of an era, post-war America, which really pushed on all of its inhabitants, especially middle and working class people, the idea of the American dream, the pursuit of the monolithic capitalist system that we now have embraced so fully. And I spent the bulk of my years attempting to try to become important in ways that I now realize have no meaning. Aggregation of wealth, aggregation of material goods. And so my life has been, and with Doug's death, that experience was the catalyst to change the way I saw the world. And I think it was an important message that I can give to younger people, to try to think about things that have more value than simply trying to be successful, wealthy, gaining power. Those things are fleeting. What I'm trying to do now is trying to make an impression and have an impact on individuals who are struggling with mental illness, their families, and that's using my son's story and his image and his persona as a way to help people down the road who may wind up experiencing the same thing that we did. So that's kind of myself in a nutshell.
You captured a lot with that answer. That was very well put. And I think it's true for a lot of us who are drawn to NAMI or drawn to sociology, a mental health type area, because of our own personal pain, our own personal journey. We do go through that phase of realizing what's important and what we thought was important, but maybe isn't so much. So that's, yeah, that resonates with me a lot. And so
let me just say, I have the opportunity to impart that message to some 120 or so young people every semester, because I teach 4 classes of roughly 30 people in a class. And so that's such a great opportunity for me to try to, like I said, impart that message, that the thinking that, you know, what's more important in our lives than helping other people, helping pave the way for people to have comfort when they're dealing with difficult situations. And hopefully I'll be able to have some impact on young people for as long as I can teach.
Mm-hmm. Well, that does my heart good to hear that we need more people, role models and people telling their story, more educators who are on that page. So thank
Yeah.
you for that. And we'll be talking about mental health in your family. Let's start with an earlier generation. Who was your Uncle Harry?
Uncle Harry. So my father was born in 1920. His older brother, Harry, I think was 8 years older or 8 or 9 years older. Their mother died when my father was 10. Their father was an alcoholic, as was his father, my dad's grandfather, and ultimately as was my father. So there was mental illness in the family. The information I have about Harry is sketchy because I don't know if you're aware, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia when he was about 25. So this would have been around 1935 or so. Schizophrenia was never even a diagnosis until around 1910. So it was a relatively new diagnosis. And what happened to Harry, according to my dad, was he was immediately, he characterized it one time as, he said, I think Harry was walking around talking about the fact that he was Napoleon and was going to conquer England. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what my dad said. That's what he characterized schizophrenia that way, as being very, very explosive psychotic episodes. So Harry was taken into an institution, the Elgin Asylum in the western suburb of Chicago, and spent the rest of his life there. And the anecdote that I share in the book was that when my brother and I was 8 or 9 and my brother was 10 or 11, would accompany my dad to the Elgin Asylum to see Harry. And what's important about that experience was we all need a frame of reference to understanding what mental illness is, right? And so when Doug ultimately was diagnosed with schizophrenia, the first thing I thought of, almost the first thing I thought of, was Harry. And remembering how Harry was really what I could characterize as an empty shell of a man. We would go visit him, he'd sit on a bench, empty stares, wouldn't talk. I talked about nicotine stained fingers. He was a chain smoker, and my dad would bring him cartons of cigarettes. And that was my impression of Harry. So he had a lobotomy, electroshock therapy, all of those things that were happening to individuals in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And that's what I was thinking about. That's what my son's going to be like. And it was a terrifying thought and that's why I brought it up in the book, because it was my only frame of reference for what schizophrenia was. And here's the thing. I think all of us need to be aware that we need to be more educated about what diagnoses are, what they mean or what they don't mean. And that's why I wanted to illustrate that with that anecdote in the book. So that was my Uncle Harry. I met him 3 or 4 times in my life.
Mm. Yeah, that does create quite a frame of reference. And then that definitely does sound terrifying. But what was your life like then before Doug Jr. developed schizophrenia?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I was on the capitalist, the capitalist mission most of my adult life before Doug was diagnosed and ultimately when he died. So the idea, I met my wife, Wendy. I had been divorced from Doug's mother. And I met my wife, Wendy, in 1980. We got married in 82. We're going to celebrate our 40th anniversary this year, by the way.
Ooh, wow.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And we had a wonderful life. We have 2 children, Jake and Kelsey, who are now in their early 30s. Had a nice homes, nice cars, all of that, a nice life. But it was driven by my desire to be successful financially in business. Part of that has to do with my dad wanting to show him that I could do what he had achieved and some of that personal, but more, I think I was part of this whole, as I said, the monolithic capitalist paradigm that we are driven to be successful. So that was what life was like. It was good. It was fine. It was satisfying. And then he was diagnosed. And what's most interesting is I didn't give up on that idea, even through the 8 years that he was, that I was giving care to him and supporting him and helping him. But when he died was when the reflection began for me to realize that this is not what I really want to try to achieve, and what was this all about? And I even thought about the fact that some of my capitalistic, business pursuits might have had a negative effect on Doug. I might have ignored him. I might not have been as thoughtful about him, as paid enough attention to him, put more stress on him because of the divorce, for example. So many of these things came into my thought process as I wrote this book, because I really had to reflect on what did my life mean and what did it mean to my children that I was just not aware of while they were alive, both of them.
You are very candid in your book about those reflections of self-doubt and the questioning, and that's so typical. At NAMI, we talk about that very often in our family to family class, in our support groups, and we say, you don't know what you don't know. It's heartbreaking.
It is. It is. And one of the reasons I included a lot of that in the book was because I wanted people who read it to feel that there are other people that may be experiencing exactly the same thing that they're going through, and I don't want them to feel that they can't talk about it, they can't be honest about it. And I wasn't honest about it, even to myself. It was only upon reflection years later, as I wrote the book and thought about my past life, and I want to help other people maybe not make that same mistake that I made.
It's courageous of you to put it out there. That was.
I appreciate that.
Absolutely. So what signs and symptoms did you see in Doug when his illness began? How did he change?
Well, this is interesting. So he lived in Pittsburgh, as I mentioned earlier, and my wife and I and our children lived in the western suburbs of Chicago. So we didn't see Doug. He didn't live with us. He visited in the summers. There was one year when he was in middle school that he came and lived with us, and we did see he had some problems relating to other kids, and he was very uncomfortable. He wound up living with us for a year and then wanted to go back to live with his mother in Pittsburgh. But other than that, I can honestly say that I didn't see any of this coming. Neither one of us, we knew he was not a productive student. He was an average to below average student, wasn't highly motivated. Even in high school, I was aware that he was smoking pot and maybe doing some other things like that, drinking beers on occasion, but I never really thought that there was a serious problem. And this is really something that I think is important to emphasize, that, intelligent, loving, well-meaning parents can miss a lot of signs and miss a lot that's going on. So maybe I couldn't have seen anything, maybe there wasn't much there, but in hindsight, Doug told me many times after he was diagnosed that he thought he had been experiencing symptoms probably from the middle of high school or maybe even sooner, earlier. So what did we miss? I don't know what we missed. When it actually happened, when he had a psychotic break, it happened to be a visit. He had been a freshman in college in the fall semester. So early in the spring, he came to visit us, and his mother had been communicating with me that he wasn't going to school and he decided to drop out, and she thought it was drug problems. And, I didn't really have much communication with him on that, but when he got there, I read about this in the book. When Wendy and I first saw him the day he arrived, we were immediately concerned. Just his demeanor, it was very different. He was sullen and he seemed angry, and it was very dark. And then it was just a few days later, he had the psychotic break when he was staying at his sister's house, where he was talking about, why do people have to die? And she called the police, and later that night I talked to the policeman, and he was saying, I think he might be psychotic, he might be schizophrenic. He's having hallucinations, you need to get him into the hospital and so on. So it was all very sudden, and maybe it shouldn't have been. And I still reflect on that. Maybe I should have seen signs. It's so easy to, when a young person is having difficulties, to avoid the idea of mental illness, not even to think about it, and to think, well, it's either drugs or he's, I might have even thought, maybe it's his mother's bad parenting. I don't know. I can't remember for sure, but because we were not in great terms. But I know I'm rambling a little bit here, but I just think it's important to emphasize that we have to be really acutely aware when we see things that don't seem right with our children. We can't just ignore it. And unfortunately, sometimes if you don't ignore it, maybe you can catch something before the break happens, which, obviously in my case, it didn't happen. So we saw this psychotic break, and then everything was exposed.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine how difficult it would be, because teenagers aren't known for being even keel or having a lot of emotional regulation.
Right. Yeah, it is very difficult. And I don't want to leave anybody listening to this with the idea that, well, if I miss it, there's something I'm doing wrong. But I'm just trying to emphasize the idea that maybe we should be more careful of thinking about maybe there's something, maybe it is a mental disorder, maybe it is something that could be attended to, and not just kind of attribute to possibly drugs or drinking, or just our child lacking motivation. I think it's a fair point to make that we need to be as aware of mental health issues as we can, and they're getting more and more pervasive. I can tell you that as a professor at a university where I teach 120 students a semester. It's really frightening how many of them are talking about the fact that they're dealing with anxiety, stress, and so on. And it's getting worse. I think society is imposing a lot of stress on young people, and it's not getting any better.
Yeah, a lot of valid points there. Certainly the pandemic seems to be increasing pressure on,
Yes.
I think, young people in particular.
Yeah.
And you're right, stigma is a big reason that parents and individuals don't want to consider mental health as a possible issue. We want that to be the last possibility, so then
Exactly.
put it off and don't want to look at that. But Doug did come a long way during his time living with schizophrenia. Before he died, he had a reliable job, a girlfriend, his own apartment, or a shared apartment. It seemed like he was headed in a positive, stable direction. So what happened between diagnosis towards him getting to that fairly positive point?
Well, as many people who have been through this journey can attest, there's not a identifiable positive trajectory that anyone can say, okay, here's what we do. We're going to do this, this, and this, and our child is going to be fine in 3 years or 5 years or whatever. In our case, we were very fortunate from the beginning that we got him into a good program. As I said, we were in the western suburbs of Chicago. We got him into a program in Western Cook County, which was very comprehensive, very good program. Loyola University Hospital, along with a local organization. He got therapy, he got housing, he got some vocational training, he got a job, but he didn't really achieve, I don't know, a balanced existence. He was drinking too much. He was and he was having interactions with locals that were, uncomfortable for him. So after a couple of years, he went back to Pittsburgh, and the same thing was going on there in Pittsburgh for a while. So I'm going to just contract all this discussion to say that it probably was about 5 or 6 years where things were very uncomfortable. He just wasn't progressing. He was able to live in a group home, perhaps, or share an apartment. What happened was in year 6 or so, he moved from one apartment to another, different catchment area. This is in the Pittsburgh area, in the western suburbs of Pittsburgh. And he wound up going into a new community centered community health center, excuse me, and got a new therapist whose name was Julie, who I highlight in the book, who I call her Saint Julie, because she was literally the savior, I think, of my son. And when he first started going to see Julie as his therapist, he would call me and tell me about her and how much he liked her and how positive it was. And she convinced him to stop drinking, stop smoking pot, to get serious, so in a really relatively brief period of time, after meeting Julie, he started focusing on getting a job. He started thinking about his future, going back to school, normalizing his social life, which prior to that had been in a constant upheaval. And it was just wonderful to see that transition. And I attribute it a lot to his maturity, but also Julie helping him understand the need to be more of an adult, need to be more mature. She told me when I interviewed her after just a few years ago, when I was working on the book, she told me that he had stopped maturing when he was about 14 or 15 and didn't begin development again until they got into their therapy session. So he lost about, 8-10 years of maturation. And that was the catalyst, his relationship with her. And what's interesting is he thought of her as I think a mothering figure, a woman he respected and had confidence in. She was only 2 years older than he was at the time, which was very interesting. So that's kind of the trajectory. It was 8 years, 5 to 6 years of really difficult experiences, improving, falling back, on meds, off meds, all that stuff that most of us are familiar with who have gone through it. But then he found the right therapist, the right medication, and everything changed. And it was wonderful. It's a wonderful experience.
It's amazing the difference that one person can make.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It really is. I can't think about that whole story without putting Julie at the very top of the list of people that helped my son.
Mm-hmm. It's also interesting, your comment about how his maturity topped out at a certain age until he got back into therapy. I've heard that's true for folks who start drinking heavily, for folks who experience trauma. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
When an illness is traumatic, it stops you from having normal experiences that help you grow and socialize. I hadn't thought of it that way before.
Yeah, and I wish I had been aware of that. When you're thinking about your child, and I talked about this in the Stigma chapter, you want your children to be okay. You want them to have the potential to be successful and achieve things. And when they don't, I think many of us, at least in my case, I was just frustrated with him. And it really, looking back and talking to Julie and thinking about his trajectory, it wasn't his fault. He just didn't have the opportunity to mature because he was being overwhelmed with the psychotic experiences of hallucinations, auditory, visual hallucinations, and difficulty in thinking. And I know there were many times when I felt frustrated with him. And I wish I could have. I wish I could go back and change that. But my message to other parents, it's so difficult, but you have to be patient with children that are going through this, especially the serious psychotic experiences. But there is hope that if you are patient, if you continue to work with them and try to make changes that might ultimately benefit them, there is hope that they can get better, and as Doug did.
Mhm. It's amazing the difference between your Uncle Harry's experience and the treatments and the therapies that are available today.
That's a great point. I mean, Harry had no chance, as we know in hindsight, what they were doing to patients. They were basically trying to manage them so that they wouldn't be out of control. And now that we have more insight into what's actually going on with these young people, these individuals, that we can help them get back to quote unquote relatively normal existence. And I think that potential is there, especially with the antipsychotic drugs that are available now, and with judicious and well-meaning diagnoses, in which that's a problem too. As a sociologist, I see that, and that's a whole nother topic. But I think generally, if we can support our kids, our family members, and just be patient, good things can happen.
Mm, very good. You've mentioned stigma a couple times, and your book actually has a chapter on stigma. Certainly is a big part of anyone's experience if mental illness is part of your life. What does stigma do to folks with mental illness and the family, and how does it relate to access to care?
Well, there's a really quite a spectrum of reaction to stigma. I think mine was pretty standard. So when I first recognized that he was diagnosed, or first realized he was diagnosed, and we knew about it, he had probably hidden a lot of symptoms from us because of the potential stigma, and from his friends and his family in Pittsburgh. I have no doubt about that. And he didn't, once he was diagnosed, he didn't want us to make our family aware, talk to neighbors and so on. But I bought into that, and this is where I feel bad, and I feel I still have a lot of guilt about the fact that I talk about this in the book very candidly, I literally hid my child from my neighbors because he didn't live with us. They weren't going to be exposed to him, and I would make up their life situation so it was a little bit more positive. And one of the things as a sociologist, I want to kind of, on a tangent that I think is important for us to understand, especially in this hyper success oriented system that we are operating in right now. People want their children to be successful. People do not want to acknowledge that their children are not going to be as good a student, get a good job as their neighbors. And so it's almost a situation, especially middle class, upper middle class, where we don't want our neighbors to think that our kids are not as potentially successful as their kids are. So we tend to, in my case, hide that. And that's not very healthy. What we want to do as a society is reduce the pressure on ourselves and our children to be quote unquote successful. What does that mean? And that goes back to the whole question of how do we think about what is success? And in our system, success is measured by money, power, material goods. And if we have a child who doesn't look like they're going to measure up to that potential, that's stigmatizing. That's something we're going to hide. And so if you think about combating stigma, what I talk about with my students now, I teach a class called the Sociology of Mental Disorder. And I talk about the idea that we want to normalize mental illness. Now that's quite a departure from what we traditionally think about as the opposite, that mental illness separates people, puts them in another category. What we want to do is recognize that by some estimates, over 50% of our population are experiencing some form of a diagnosed mental illness. There are 300 and some diagnoses in the DSM-5. So we know that a lot of people are dealing with a lot of diagnosed experiences. If over 50% of the population, or even approaching 50% or 40%, whatever the real number is, which is difficult to ascertain, we can't separate all those individuals and say they're in another category. What we want to do is normalize this and say we can accept the fact that individuals experience anxiety or EHD or whatever the diagnosis may be, and just say, okay, that's who they are, that's their identity, that's fine. Let's accept them and let's help them navigate life, and period. And as parents, especially, to accept those circumstances rather than feel stigmatized because they're in that situation is very unhealthy for the family. It's very unhealthy for the individual.
Mm. One of the comments that jumped out at me in the book was that parents have a natural tendency to see their children as a marker of their own value.
Yeah.
And that does really, that puts a big burden on the child.
It does. And children are for the most part, not aware of that consciously. They may be aware of the stress and the pressure they're under. And I'll again mention the fact that I'm teaching this class. I want to tell you a quick anecdote that relates to this topic. Just a few weeks ago, I was showing some video in our classes. In this class, we showed somebody who was being interviewed who had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, somebody who had a diagnosis of bipolar 1, and somebody who had a diagnosis of anxiety disorder. And so I asked the class after we watched these videos, how many people do you know or are you aware of or involved with who had schizophrenia? And a couple of the students raised their hand. Same question about bipolar disorder. A couple of students raised their hand. Third question, how many of you are engaged with or involved with individuals who have anxiety disorder? And I swear to you, just about every single student in that class put their hand up. Mm-hmm. Probably at least 70 or 80% of them. Mm-hmm. And we talked about it then. I said, I was blown away, frankly. It was surprising that many of them were so willing to acknowledge that. And we talked about it for the rest of the class and the next class period. And it turns out that most of it has to do, at least they think it has to do with the stress they're under as college students to be successful, to test well, to be able to then get a good job with a good GPA. And so where is that pressure coming from? They're not putting it on themselves. It's coming from the environment, the social environment that they're operating in, that says you must be a college student, you must be successful, you must get a good job. And they don't like that pressure. And who's putting that pressure on them? I think we all are, and we have to change that. Mm. Big order. I know that's a big order, but we got to work on it.
Well, one step at a time, one day at a time.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that hyper competitiveness, it doesn't help. Okay, so I'm seeing some wonderful comments in the chat, supportive of you and how this is a powerful session. So thank you for your comments, folks. Appreciate that very much. It seems like a good time to go to the cover of your book. Tell us about the cover of the book.
Yeah, so the cover of the book was really came from the idea of my granddaughter. So my daughter Melissa, who she suffered with bipolar disorder and ultimately alcoholism, passed away 5.5 years ago. But her daughter, her youngest child of 4, Cami, who is now 17, a high school senior, Camden Does Art is her Instagram tag, and Cami is an excellent artist, and she works in the sort of the pen and ink genre mostly. And when it came to the idea of doing a cover for the book, I was thinking about what could I do? Find a photograph, get an illustration. And I thought of Cami. So I emailed her and I said, I'm writing this book about your uncle. Your mom's going to be in it. I'm going to be in it. Wendy is, Grandma. And so I said, would you be interested in developing the cover, the artwork for the cover? So we worked for about 2 months. So this is literally completely her idea. I didn't tell her what to do. I just said, I gave her a picture that I had of Doug, a headshot. And I said, you can use this if you want to use it. And so she came up with this cover, and it's amazing. It really tells the story of the broken boy. The fact that is, she said, to me, it sounds like his head was exploding. And that's why she created this illustration. And
Yeah.
And I've received a lot of feedback from individuals who are much more professional than I am as far as this goes, and they think it's a fantastic cover, and I'm going to give Cami all of the credit for that. So I would encourage people who get the book. Her Instagram tag is under her picture on page 2, I think it is, and go look at some of her other art. She's really excellent, and it was a thrill to be able to work with my granddaughter on this project.
Yeah, it's very striking. You can tell she has a lot of talents. So back to the parents' experience, your book addresses a loss that parents experience when mental illness invades their home, invades their child. You said the grief is complicated and seemingly never ending. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I'm not I don't study this area as a sociologist, but I wanted to delve into it actually when I did my dissertation just a couple of years ago. The idea that, so we have a child who we know, we have a relationship that's been built up over, is it 10 years, 12 years, 15 years, whatever, 18 years in my case, 19. And then all of a sudden, there's a diagnosis of mental illness, and especially when a psychotic break is involved and the individual just immediately changes from one consistent kind of activity or action to another. And I just recognize that this is an area that I don't think is well researched in sociology or psychology or in the medical field and mental health field, that parents, whether they know it or not, they've lost that child, especially if it's something like schizophrenia, bipolar, that's not really going to go away. Maybe it's manageable, but it's not going to go away. And that's what I was referring to in that chapter. Society should recognize, the medical field, the people that are treating their child should recognize that what the parents are going through. I think I have a line that some physicians think about this as evidence of pathology when the parents are struggling with just how do I deal with this, and they're anxious and they're angry and they're frustrated. Well, that's not pathology. That's just them dealing with grief. And I attribute it to grief of the loss of the child that they knew. And maybe that child is still there physically, maybe living with them, but the child is not the same. And so they've lost that, and they have to come to terms with that. What makes it complicated is, and I've been through both, so I can speak with authority on this. When you lose a child to death, there is a finality to that one can eventually accept, because that child is gone and you don't see them again. You may think about them every day, which I do, but it's different when that child is still there. You're still taking care of that child. You're still taking care of that individual, and but they're not the same. They don't give you the feedback. They don't give you the love that they were giving you prior to that. They don't give you what you need, perhaps as a parent, but you still have to take care of them. And it makes it even, in some ways, even more difficult. I think, I would argue that in some ways it's even more difficult than losing a child to death, especially if they're not capable of achieving some level of reasonable functionality. And I've known people, and I'm sure you have as well, Peg, who are dealing with children for 10, 15, 20 years who really aren't getting any better, and it's just a constant struggle. And so there's a sense of grief, a sense of loss that I think we need to think about more and be more aware of with family members, especially of children.
I agree completely. The caretaker's burden, that ambiguous loss, the guilt and shame that gets folded into it, the ongoing work, which is very draining. That's a lot. That's a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah.
So this was a good moment, or really a moment in the book that made me smile. Doug surprised you with a phone call just before he died. What did he say, and what did that mean to you?
Oh, wow. That's a double-edged situation, because it was the best and ultimately made it in some ways the worst. So he called me one morning, 8 o'clock in the morning. I was getting ready for work, and the phone rings and I answered it. It's, hey Dad, what's up? And that's his typical way of salutation when I got on the phone. And I immediately started thinking about, well, is there a problem? Why is he calling me? I still wasn't used to the fact that he was really, functioning pretty well. And he said, well, I was just calling to tell you how good I'm doing. Now, that's not good proper English, but that's how he said it. I'm just calling to tell you how good I'm doing and how happy I am. And that literally is what he said. And I said, oh man, that's so good to hear. And I couldn't get over the fact that he decided to pick up the phone and share that with me. So we talked a little bit about a couple things that were going on in his life. And he had talked about going back to school, and his friend Chuck, who I talk about in the book, had graduated from the University of Pittsburgh and was helping Doug navigate the return to school potentially, and understanding what he had to do in order to reapply and all that. But he and I had talked a few weeks earlier about making an appointment with a counselor to kind of talk about what he would need to do to get back to school. And so he told me about that. He had the appointment made. He said, by the way, I can't see her until after the holidays because the school's closed down. This was on December 19th. These kinds of things, it was just such a fantastic conversation, very normal, very pragmatic. These are the things I'm doing. I'm excited, I feel good, and I just wanted to share it with you. So that's like, okay, this is a great phone call. I hear a horn ring in the back, or a horn honk in the background, and it's his boss to pick him up to go to work. So we said goodbye. And, as I stated in the book, that was the last time I spoke to him. And 3 days later, I get the call from my daughter saying he was killed in an accident. And it was just like, wow. I mean, he made it. So it's like, how do I, even 20 some years later, how do I reconcile those two things? The feeling of being so elated that he had gotten to where he got, and then this devastation that he got that far, and then he gets killed in this random accident that had nothing to do with any of this. I still struggle with it, obviously, but on balance, I think about the positive, the fact that he got to where he was. He was happy. He had friends. He had a girl he was seeing, excited about, and a job, and so all of that makes me feel good that he achieved that. And I just admire the heck out of him for what he went through to get there. And as I say in the book, he's a hero to me for having done what he did.
Well, and you're one of the millions of unsung heroes standing behind the heroes that do that work of recovery. So appreciate that too.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. I think this would be a good time to go to the video of the week. And this is well, before I do that, I want to thank our volunteers and friends working behind the scenes. We've got Paulina Mendez, our intern on chat, Gail, psychiatric nurse Gail Pruitt on Facebook, and Executive Director Gary Kreitz for always being there. And of course, thank you so much to you, Doug, for taking your time and sharing your story with us.
You're welcome. So happy to do it.
And for the video, our guest tonight, Doug, you have several uplifting segments on TV news, and I thought we could feature one of those. And this one has 1.3 million hits, So if you haven't seen it already, it's time to have a look. Do you want to add anything, Doug?
I just wanted to say that this was a random event in a class I was teaching 3 or 4 years ago at the University of Tampa. One of my students surprised me. It was really a great experience and a lot of fun, and I've gotten a lot of good feedback from it. So I'm glad you decided to show it because it's fun.
Yeah, it's very cute and uplifting. So we're gonna check this out online. So the way I found this was on a social media post on Twitter. And the gentleman says, a few weeks prior, my professor was teaching us about different cultures and asked me, Dylan, why do you wear a do-rag? Is it part of your culture? I told him, nah, it's my lifestyle. So a few weeks later, I surprised him with his own do-rag to become part of the lifestyle.
Mr. Engelman, got an announcement, guys. So, you told us a little bit about your culture and everything, so I'd like to put you on my culture and lifestyle, you know, just up to the front, you know. So, got you a little gift. You know, it's not what it seems like, guys. But, you know, had to show love to you, man. Just similar to you, man. Oh, yeah. There. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I'm going to teach you how to put it on all that, man. We're going to put it all together. I got it. Get it. Do is this.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And as much as you're going to get like me. Same way. All right, so what you do is this. Put it on. Do that. Just like that. Yeah. So you grab it like this. Alright, so this is my little motto. Loop-de-loop them pool, and you do rags looking cool. Loop, pool.
Are you filming this?
And then you come back like this. Like to, you see how I crossed it?
Yeah.
Now come around to your forehead, cross it again. And then make a bow.
Do I look as stupid as I feel?
You look amazing, G. You look amazing. You go home with that. You're going to love you.
Oh, that's a lot of fun.
That was a lot of fun. I'm glad you showed that. That was good to see.
Yeah. I think that's the most unique and interesting video of the week that we've shown.
Good to know.
Yeah, absolutely. So now it's time to take questions from you, members of our virtual studio audience on Facebook and on Zoom. If you haven't used the Q&A before, it's a small icon with a conversation bubble towards the bottom left of your screen. Go ahead and type in your question and we will deliver it to Dr. Engelman. This is from Suzanne Botts. I have the privilege of being a facilitator for family-to-family support group and the class. It seems in my short COVID impacted time in these two NAMI resources, there are many parents supporting their children struggling with mental illness. I saw an interview this morning about a new book discussing how parenting never stops, especially for those who support their children who are dealing with mental illness. I expect that more people are impacted by the pandemic-induced isolation, etc. Can you comment if you think there are more people in this parent supporting child situation?
I'm not. I think there are not enough people. I don't know how, if this is the kind of the answer that the individual is looking for. I also took the family-to-family course after my son died because I wanted to experience it and see what kinds of things NAMI was doing. This is up in DuPage County, up in Illinois. And I think that not enough parents are willing to, and I don't know if this is what the question is addressing, but not enough parents are willing to acknowledge the situation and go in and seek support like this. And I think one of the things that NAMI, the most important challenges that NAMI has is to broaden the reach to families through a program like Family to Family, and bring them in. And again, this is the objective, is in some ways to sort of normalize these situations so that they don't feel so stigmatized, so that they feel more open to being educated and communicating with their child in a way that is helpful to them rather than hurtful and expressing frustration and anger. So Family to Family is a fantastic program. And again, I don't know if this is what the question was actually asking, but I hope that helps kind of frame this, that we really need to emphasize Family to Family as much as possible as individuals who are working with NAMI.
Absolutely. And Suzanne Botts also shared some information about a book, which I put in the chat. So it looks like it came from me. A new book, Difficult: Mothering Challenging Adult Children Through Conflict and Change by Judith R. Smith. So that did not come from me. That was from Suzanne Botts. Thank you for that contribution. Question from Gary. Thinking of your uncle and your son, what role do you think genetics play in the occurrence of schizophrenia?
Oh boy, that's an ongoing debate. I'm teaching this mental disorder, sociology of mental disorder class, and we talk a lot about trying to understand the genesis of mental illness, what it actually is, where it comes from. And I just believe that I've come to arrive at this point where I believe that there are multiple influences that culminate in a mental illness experience, and one of them is genetic. So I do believe there's a genetic component, especially with schizophrenia. I've read more research on that recently, that it's individuals who are researchers are pretty well convinced that schizophrenia is one of the more genetically transferred diseases. But I also believe that there are predispositions, and I think this is a position that most people are taking, that someone might be genetically, predisposed to a serious mental illness, but the environment that that individual is in has almost as much to do with it as the genetic predisposition. In other words, if the individual hadn't been placed in a particularly stressful situation, I refer to this in my book about my children who went through a divorce. Very stressful relationship between their mother and myself, and a lot of anger. They were placed in the middle. And I firmly believe that because of my uncle, my family history with both mental illness and alcoholism, Doug was probably predisposed, but I think the stress and the environment that he was placed in as a youngster, and even growing up living with a single mom, because I was living in another town, had been remarried, had developing another family. I think his environment also contributed to his schizophrenia. So I'm not a clinician, I don't want to try to answer questions that would indicate that I know more than I do. So that's my take on it. I do think it's comprised of many different factors. Genetics being one of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does seem very complex. We have a lighthearted question from Chuck. Why did you not choose the pink do-rag?
Well, I think that exposes my gender bias. That's all I can tell you. I'm a sociologist, so I go right to the gender bias idea that I just didn't want to be portrayed as being feminine. So I apologize to all the women in the audience for that, but that's a great question. I've never been asked that before.
I thought that was kind of fun.
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about your work with young people at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. What do you tell them, and how's the NAMI on campus doing there?
Well, I shared with you the anecdote about what happened in my classroom a few weeks ago. NAMI on campus is having an impact on getting the word out there. It's a very hardworking, thoughtful, caring group of students. and they're doing a lot of work. They're putting together probably 4 or 5 different events every semester, which is incredibly difficult when you're college students with all the pressure for grades and being involved in other activities on campus. I'm just amazed at how effective they are. And now that I'm on the board of NAMI Wilmington, I also was just named the faculty advisor for NAMI on campus. So my mission is to bring those 2 organizations together as much as possible. And Chuck Eldridge, who is with NAMI Wilmington, the president, is very, very motivated to start working more and more with NAMI on campus, with the university. So the vision I have is to try to pull those 3 elements, organizations together: the university, NAMI on campus, NAMI Wilmington, and we can really create a very, very dynamic environment that will support the students who are, as I said earlier, more and more and more are experiencing especially anxiety and even more serious mental health experiences. So I kudos to NAMI on campus. I love those students, and I'm so proud to be able to work with them. And I think we're just going to do more and more and more, especially with the help of Chuck over at NAMI Wilmington.
That's wonderful to hear. This is the perfect time for NAMI support to be growing on campus with young people. And I'm sure with your experience and your approachable manner that you're doing a lot of good in that area as well.
Well, I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah. So I see a hand up from Robert Taglin. Robert, do you have something you'd like to say? You'll need to unmute. Well, maybe he hit that by accident. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Am
Okay.
I on now?
Oh, there he is. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry. I just wanted to say that I read your book and it was very moving. And thank you for sharing that. And
Well,
thank you for sharing this. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate the comments, and I have to share. One of my students said my mother read the book and it made her cry, and I said I don't want to make women or anybody cry, but I'm glad it moves people, and I appreciate you telling me that, Robert. That's very meaningful to me and very humbling as well.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you for that. What gives you hope?
Well, just the fact that I'm doing what I'm doing gives me hope. If you had asked me 10 years ago, 15 years ago, what I thought I would be doing when I was 73, I would not be a professor at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and have just published a book. So that gives me hope personally, but in a broader sense, I have so much hope when I see the enthusiasm of individuals who are attending meetings at NAMI Wilmington. I see the students who are willing to, every one of them, throw their hand up and say, yeah, I'm struggling with anxiety. So they're willing to share that with us. And so I think the younger generation are going to be more and more willing to drop that stigma, to be willing to face whatever comes their way by acknowledging their mental health problems, challenges. And so that gives me a lot of hope. And I just think there's a building, just a dynamic building momentum. I see it on campus, and I see it in other contexts, that individuals in our society are becoming more and more aware of mental health challenges and the need to support people who are dealing with mental health problems. So that gives me a lot of hope. I hope I'm around long enough to see some major changes. And that's what my mission is. So,
Absolutely. We have a lull in the questions. We've got a few more minutes. If you'd like to ask Dr. Engelman a question, please type it into the Q&A or in the comment box on Facebook. I'm going to make some announcements while we've got a moment. Please join us next week. I'll be interviewing a young woman who has done a study on body image, the idolization of health has affected body image during the pandemic. Really interesting student. She'll be telling us all about that. Please fill out our survey. Once you leave the Zoom meeting, you will magically find a Survey Monkey there. It helps us improve over time. It helps us keep our grant funding in place, and we appreciate your support so much. Let us know what we need to do better. It's important. If you'd like to be a speaker on Thursdays with NAMI, please take the survey and leave me your name and contact information. Let me know what you'd like to talk about. And let's see, we've got 2 more questions coming up. From Gary, I think we as parents, especially as parents of mentally ill children, need to forgive ourselves. How does one do that?
Ooh, well, I'm not very good at that, so I might not be the best person to answer that. I'm constantly evaluating what happened with my son. I've gotten better at forgiving myself. The way I'm helping to forgive myself is just to do as much as I can to help other people, and to recognize that we are frail human beings. We miss a lot of things, even if we're caring, thoughtful parents. We miss a lot of things. So just try to be kind to yourself and recognize that you're not perfect. At any moment, when you do start thinking about forgiving yourself and recognizing the mistakes you've made, that's the beginning of that process. So that's the time to start feeling good about where you are, and the ability to forgive yourself and to be able to move on and try to do better for other people. Enjoy NAMI.
I love that answer. It can be hard to forgive ourselves for whatever errors we've convicted ourselves of in life.
Yeah, yes, it can.
From Paulina, you mentioned having to deconstruct some of your thoughts around success and capitalism. What are some other myths that you've had to untangle? Good question.
Wow. Well, as I'm a sociologist, so I can't stray too far from talking about what I consider the negative impact of the capitalist system, and it infiltrates a lot of institutions. It might be responsible for our political upheaval, the racism, the othering in society, gender biases, and so on. So capitalism is it's a great institution. Capitalism is a great machine for developing innovation, developing societies. But on the other hand, if it gets out of control, it can become impossible to manage. And I think we're at the precipice of that point right now, where we are losing control of the capitalist system, the capitalist engine. And I have a lot of fear about that, frankly. I don't know if that's answering the question accurately, but there are so many tangents to this topic that we could do a whole interview on this alone. As a sociologist, this is what we attend to quite a bit of our time, talking about society and where it's going, and how we have to think about being more careful and thoughtful about separating class, the division in wealth that's happening in not only in the US, but Western society and even globally. So that's a big topic. It's a great question. It's a big topic, and I don't think I can answer it completely. But
what comes to mind as I hear you talk about those things is a couple of things. NAMI North Carolina's concern and desire to see Medicaid expansion happen in North Carolina. There is some interest that seems to ebb and flow among both parties. Well, I think one party would take it in a heartbeat if they could.
yeah.
And it seems like there's a ray of hope right now. I also just have to say, this is me speaking for my own values. I sure wish the profit motive could be just completely divorced from healthcare. It's just not helpful.
Yeah.
yeah, that's one of my biggest concerns in our world.
Well, you got a sociologist on, so I can't help but talk about this. I'm a medical sociologist, but I don't study the science of medicine. I study the business of medicine, and medicalization that happened in our country in the early 20th century had transformed medicine from a caregiving enterprise to a profit-making enterprise. And we haven't looked back from that, and we need to, because if we continue to think about medical care and medicine as a profit-making enterprise, we're going to lose too many people. There's too much of a separation in health and race, access to care. People of color have much less access to care than white people, and it's a huge problem in the medical community, and it is driven by capitalism and its relationship with the political institutions. And so this is a big problem, much bigger than what we came to talk about here tonight. But I like to spread the word that the idea that we have to be aware of this, and we have to think about the fact that if we have major segments of our population that are unhealthy, it hurts all of us. And that's one of the messages I keep pounding with my classes. We have to diffuse this division in classes and get people all on the same level with medical care, with food security, with education, big issues. Mental health care is one of them, and it's a very big issue too, but it's one of many that the capitalist system has really not attended to as well as it might.
Absolutely. And I think if you're someone who worries about spending and dollars, it's important to note that the absence of preventative care in the health system leads to much greater expenses because you get these complex cases. So Medicaid expansion would save money in the long run.
Right, exactly. Yeah. You know, the old adage, a rising tide lifts all boats. If the poorest among us are healthier, everybody in the country will be healthier, and the country itself will be healthier, both physically and financially. There's no question about that, but we have to get there. We have to get the powers that be to understand to spread the wealth is a good thing and a logical thing and a smart thing to do.
Absolutely. Question from Gail. Is it possible to enroll in your course without matriculating through a program?
Ooh, you know, Gail, I'm not sure. I don't think so, but I can look into that. If you want to email me, engelmand@uncw.edu, engelmand@uncw.edu. If you send me an email, I will look into that. I would love to have people from the outside enrolling in the course. There are options such as just observing courses. You might still have to pay something without getting credit, but you know, college credit, but that is an option. So if you're interested, send me an email and I'll look into it, because I love that question. Somebody wants to take my course who's not a student there. That's cool.
Right. Do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share?
Well, I just hope that this has been helpful to some people. I'm so flattered and humbled that you asked me to do this, and I love the chance to talk about my son and our experience, and I appreciate people who care to listen to it, and I just thank you so much for allowing me to be here.
Thanks to you. It's been an absolute pleasure. I enjoyed the book, and I can tell that you have a lot to offer, both to young people and as an author. So we'll be keeping an eye out for future books too. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I want to say, we know it's hard when schizophrenia or mental illness are attached to our own lives, but those are just words. And when we talk to people who understand, when we talk to each other, those words can lose their power. So please, if you're feeling alone, give us a call. Call the NAMI helpline, join a support group, be part of this community where we all get it, because we're waiting to hear from you. Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you. Good night.